Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of YouTube videos to help you play chess better and improve your game. Today we're going to talk a little bit about chess knowledge. Now, there's really basically two types of things that make up your chess strength, which also would be the same things that help you improve, and that is knowledge versus skills and abilities. We've talked about this in the past, and most of my videos have to do with skills and abilities because they're actually the primary thing. Skills and abilities include things like analysis and evaluation and stamina and perseverance and the ability to learn from your losses and the ability to accept your losses and the ability to learn from other people and your open-mindedness and your your determination, your concentration. All these things are skills and abilities. Your visualization skill works into your analysis skill. These are probably make up about 2/3 of what it takes to be a good chess player. That's why we see 11-year-olds who are rated 1900, crushing 50-year-olds who are rated 1600, because if chess was all knowledge, then the 50-year-old who's read 200 chess books would beat the 11-year-old who's read 3 or 4 chess books because he'd have more knowledge. But chess isn't mostly knowledge. Chess is these abilities, and if the 1900 11-year-old is better at analysis and evaluation, especially analysis, he's going to beat the 1600. And after the game, when they go over the game, the 1600 is going to say something like, "Yeah, I didn't see that," when the 1900 explains to him how he made that combination that won the exchange or won a pawn or whatever it was. Okay, so we're not going to talk about abilities today. We have that in most of the other videos. We're going to talk about knowledge. And there's several areas of knowledge, but I think the 4 main ones are opening knowledge, endgame knowledge, principles, and tactical patterns. Those are the 4 main knowledge areas. There's others, of course. So let's talk about those 4. Openings we can break down into 2. One would be learning your tabiahs, which are the standard opening moves in the openings that you want to play. And 2 would be learning one new move from each game that you play, where if you play a normal opening against someone and you do something wrong on move 7, you look up the game in a book or a database or a video, and you say, all right, what am I supposed to do on move 7 there? And you extend your knowledge of the opening tree a little bit after each game that you play. So how do you do this? Well, let's start with learning one new move. I have a history here on ICC that I pulled up from someone, and let's pick a random game. Let's pick game number 62 here. So examine. Whoops, it would help if I type his name right. All right, so let's see what we can learn from this game. We're going to try to improve, for both sides actually, one move by using a database. All right, so first we'll look at the game and then we'll go back and look at the database. So white played e4, black played c5, white played knight f3, probably heading for an open Sicilian, e6. Okay, one of the main moves. d4, open Sicilian, pawn takes, knight c6. Okay, usually heading here for maybe a Tamanov. White can play knight c3, he can play c4. There's even lines, I think, where he plays knight b5. He plays c3. So that's not much of a move. All right, and now we need to figure out what should black do if white plays c3. We're going to use a database and we're going to use an engine to do this. Now, we have another video that's just on using the databases, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail that way. But let's go into a little bit of detail. Let's pull up chess.com and we'll go to Learn and we'll go to Explorer. That's their database. So you can see the database here. Let me pull it over to the left a little bit so you can see it more. All right, so there's the database. Let's play over that opening. and it was e4. We can click on the moves. We don't have to play it on the board. Either way works, by the way. If you make the move, it's the same as clicking on the board. c5, knight f3. We can see e6 is the third most popular move, but it's perfectly good, perfectly popular. e6, d4, the main move. C takes d4, that's correct. Knight takes d4. And now a6, the con, is the first one. And we can see right there that the chess.com database tells us that it's the Sicilian defense con variation if you play a6. Knight c6 was played in the game, and you can see it tells you it's called Sicilian defense Taimanov variation. So it's actually helping you with the names as well as helping you with the moves. So knight to c6. And now you can see that white played 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, the ninth most popular move, c3, and white only won 21%, drew 12, and lost 67%. Now this is what statisticians call a bias sample. It's not that c3 is so terrible that it loses 67% of the games. What it really is that people who play c3 don't know anything about openings because that's not really much of a move. So the people who got in the database who played c3 are probably fairly weak players, weaker than their opponent. And that's why black really lost 67%, white lost 67% of the games. It's not because c3 is that bad. If we give it to the computer, which we will in a second, it's not that c3 is that bad. It's just that the players playing a move like that must not understand what they're doing, and they're probably not that good. So let's click on c3, and the database is going to say, well, the two moves that did the best here are d6 for black and queen c7, but now the number of games played is very, very low. It's down to 10 for queen c7, 4 for d6. Those are the two moves that did the best. How do I know they did the best? Because they have the largest black area here to show the percent that black won. So it's probably better when there's this few games to ask the engine rather than asking the database as to what they should do. Now, we're doing it for black, but if we were doing it for white, let's go back a move. If white wants to say, what should I have played against instead of c3, we can see that the most common move by far, and one that did pretty well, is knight c3. And I had mentioned c4, knight c3, knight b5. Knight b5 is the only other move that's played, even more than about 10% of the time. It says you should play knight c3 here. So if I was white and I was learning from this game by the database after the game, I would play knight c3 next time, go into the main line of the Taimanov. But what should black do after c3? We already saw the database wasn't very helpful. There's only a few games here. So let's use the engine instead. Let's go back to ICC here. And we're going to hit this button called Analysis. Let's move it up a little in the air so that we can see the analysis. I'm going to hit the Start button, which you can't see. And now the engine is thinking, and the number on the left in parentheses is the evaluation. The number in brackets is how many half moves, how many ply. It's looking deep. And then it's showing you the number 1 means the best variation. I could also show the top 2, but right now I'm just showing the best one for black. And it's saying that he should play knight f6 and attack the e-pawn, and it says that white has a very slight advantage. Now, notice this number over here is very close to 0, minus 0.07. It's been jumping around. It was a little over that. Now it's up to 0. That tells you that earlier where it said that white lost 60, whatever it was, 67% of the games, that it wasn't because white has a terrible position here. White's basically equal. Playing c3 gave up white's advantage a little bit. It's not a terrible move. It really keeps at least equality. But the reason that white lost so many games is that people who play c3 just aren't that good, as we said. So the engine's telling black, next time he plays this game, he should play knight f6. Let's see what black played in the game. Black played d5. And Stockfish now evaluates the position. If we look at the evaluation here, he says that's not a bad move. He's hovering around 0 still. So we can see that d5 is getting an evaluation that's very similar to knight f6. So that means that black's move d5 was not a mistake. it was just about as good as his best move, knight f6, which meant it wasn't that critical that he find knight f6. And in fact, right now, he's almost holding that d5 is slightly better than knight f6, which could happen as he looks deeper and deeper. But basically, it's saying about the same. It's saying in both cases, knight f6 and d5, that black is equal. So black's move was perfectly okay, and he really can't strongly improve on that move by checking with the engine and finding out that maybe the engine would have preferred knight f6, because the evaluations are almost the same. Okay, so that's how you learn that one move after the game. Very important. How do you learn tabiahs? A tabiah are the standard moves in the opening. Well, you could pick up a book like MCO 15 and look at the main lines at the top of each page. Those are usually the tabiahs. You could buy a repertoire book. A repertoire book is a chess opening book that tells you how to play for one of the colors. They say, all right, we're going to teach you how to play an aggressive opening repertoire for white with e4, or we're going to play a solid opening repertoire for white with d4, or we're going to play a repertoire for black against d4 that's, gives you good counterattacking chances, whatever. That's, people write repertoire books for different reasons. And you could look up the game in a repertoire book. You could look it up you could watch a video on that opening. If you're using chess.com like we just did a minute ago, let's pull that back up. You could use the database, but they have another thing on chess.com that's a little bit easier than using the database for learning tabiahs. And that is, if we go under Learn, instead of hitting Explore, which is the database, we can hit the opening button. And now you pick out an opening that you want to learn the tabiah for. Scotch game, King's Indian defense, Queen's Indian defense. They have all the major openings that are played by grandmasters. They don't have a lot of the weird openings, but they have the major openings right here. Let's see, they've got 16 on the top, 16 there, and another, not 16. 4 times 3 is not 16. 12 and 12, and then 9. They've got 31 tabiah things. Let's click on one. Let's say you want to learn a main line in the Slav defense. So you click on Slav defense, and it shows you the board, and it shows you the part of the database that goes with the Slav defense. And they even give a little talk about the Slav defense. And you could say, well, if you're playing black, let's flip the board. Flip board, there it is. And we say, how did we get here? What were the moves? The moves were d4, d5, c4, c6. Okay, that's the Slav. You say, well, what's the main line of the Slav? The main line, well, here it is. The first move on the database is going to be the most popular. It's knight f3. And you're saying, well, what should I play for black? 73,000 in the database did knight f6. Only 12,000 did e6. So knight f6 if you want to learn the main line. And now it says the main line for white's knight c3. The other main line is e3. Knight c3. And now you have a choice between the old Slav, which is not that popular these days, or the becoming much more popular, or is much more popular, semi-Slav. And again, if you put the cursor on the e6, it tells you it's the semi-Slav. And if you keep clicking on these number one moves, you're pretty much going to get the tabiah. And once it starts to really branch, that's kind of the end of the tabiah. And you could learn the tabiah this way. And my suggestion is go over it many times before you try to play your first game with it. Now, your opponent's not going to play the main line unless you're very, very lucky that way. They're going to take you right out of the book, and that's okay. Don't get frustrated when they do that. Just keep learning one new move like we talked about earlier in the video. But this is how you can learn some of the main tabiahs so that when you go into the game, you say, well, this is an idea of the kind of thing that I'm aiming for, even if my opponent doesn't let me do it. Now, as a word of warning, when your opponent plays a move that's not the move that you studied, you can't just go and do the same move. For instance, let's go back a move. Let's say e6 is the next move here if white plays knight c3. But suppose white plays g3, like that. Okay, well, e6, it turns out, in this case, is the main move. Let's say white had played a crazy move like a3. Well, again, e6 could be the move, but maybe it's not. Let's see if we can find a move where e6 is not the move. Let's say white plays bishop f4. Aha, so now the number one move is bishop to f5 against that. So, you can't just keep playing the same moves just because you learn them in the tabiah. A lot of my students do that. They study, if he does A, I'll do B. If he does C, I'll do D. And then white plays A and they play B, but white doesn't do C. They do C prime, and then they do D anyway. Well, sometimes that's a great idea and it's a good move, and other times it's a terrible move, but you can't just do it just because you studied A, B, C, D, and now they play A, B, C prime. That means D might be the right move, or it might be some other move, D prime. Okay, that's for opening knowledge. Endgame knowledge. Well, there's two types of endgame knowledge. There's what Andy Soldis and others call exact endgames. Those are the ones you pick up from books. And then there are every other endgame, which are not in books. If you want to pick up endgame knowledge, which is mostly the exact endgames, there's lots of books on that. There's Silman's endgame course. There's Pandolfini's endgame course. There's books that are encyclopedias of endgames. Reuben Fine has the Encyclopedia of Chess Endings. There's all kinds of books. I think Averbach has a book, Essential Chess Endings, which has some of the basic endings. There's videos on these. I'm reading a book right here that Soldis wrote where he talks about the 25 most important exact endgames. The name of the book is 100 Chess Master Trade Secrets by Andy Soldis. So he talks about exact endgames. Exact endgames are things like Lucena and Philidor and all those kind of things that come up again and again and again. I have videos on king and pawn against king. I have a video on how to win with king and 5 pawns against king and 4. If you've never seen that video, it's really good for learning technique. These are the ways you pick up exact endgames. Now, non-exact endgames, which are by far the majority, those you get by playing over annotated master games where they get into these practical endgames and you have to read what the author's trying to say. There are books on practical endgames. There's videos, of course. You want to play long time control games, and you want to play them slowly, and you want to give yourself enough time at the end of the game to think about your endgames so that when you get into endgames, you can take time and think about them and practice them, and then after the game you can go over them with your opponent and with an engine and with a strong player, and you can talk about your endgames and what you did. A lot of my students, they get into endgames and they have no idea what to do, so instead of trying to figure it out because they're not very good at it, they just make a move to see what will happen. Well, that's not a very good way to become a good player in the endgame, because you want to think about each move and you want to play long time control games so you have the time to think about those moves, and you want to try to figure out what's going to happen. You may not be very good at it. Practice may not make you perfect, but it will make you better. If you just make moves to see what's going to happen, you're not going to pick up a lot of knowledge about the endgame. If you start analyzing the moves and you start putting them in your long-term memory and then you talk about them with good players, you slowly get to play practical endgames better and better and better. And as I said, when you're getting a book of annotated games, for instance, annotated master games like the most instructive games of chess ever played, or the McDonald series starting with Chess, the Art of Logical Thinking, or even an amateur book like my book, The World's Most Instructive Amateur Game Book. I have a whole chapter on messed up endgames that amateurs kind of played wrong for one reason or the other. And when you read that chapter, it's going to tell you about what they did wrong, what they should have done, and why, and explain the positions. And you slowly pick up this kind of practical knowledge. Okay, the third area of chess knowledge is principles. Principles are not goals. A goal is something like develop all your pieces in the opening or control the center. A principle is like a heuristic. It's a guideline. It's a little saying like move every piece once before you move any piece twice unless there's a tactic. Now you might say, but Dan, aren't goals knowledge also? And the answer is yes, but goals are a much, much smaller set of knowledge. It's true, those 3 goals in the endgame, activate all your pieces safely, efficiently is 1, control the center is 2, and get your king into some sort of safety position for the endgame is 3. Those are 3 big goals of the endgames. There's others, but there's hundreds of principles. So how do you pick up principles? Well, again, if you read instructive anthology game books, I don't mean necessarily game books like My 60 Memorable Games or Karpov's Best Games or, My Great Predecessors by Kasparov. those books are really not meant for teaching you how to play chess better, but really books like the ones I just said, the McDonald series, or my book, The World's Most Instructive Amateur Game Book, or The Most Instructive Games of Chess Ever Played, or the Giddens books, Chess Master versus Chess Amateur. These are instructive anthologies. And one of the things that my editor has me do, and I do it without his urging, but in our books, when we have a principle in an instructive anthology game book, we put it in italics to tell people this isn't just Dan commenting on the move. It's a general principle that you want to keep in mind for any kind of similar situation. And as I said, there's just millions of these principles that you pick up. With the opening, as I said, move every piece once before you move any piece twice unless there's a tactic. Knights before bishops. Don't move up just 2 pawns because you want to use your pawns to gain space. Castle your king as soon as you can. Develop your rooks to open files and semi-open files. Don't block your break moves with your pieces, and so on and so on and so on. It goes on and on and on and on and on. Okay, now there's actually entire books devoted to principles. I'm going to pick out a couple here. One is called Chess Rules of Thumb by Grandmaster Lev Albert and Al Lawrence. It has about 332 principles in the book, and they call it rules of thumb. Rules of thumb, guidelines, principles, heuristics, they're all the same thing. Here's another book, The Wisest Things Ever Said About Chess, by Andy Soltis. 250 wise little principles. Actually, more than 250. Looks like he's got 270, 87, 287, 88, 288 principles. Like the last one in the book by Andy Soltis here. Again, the name of the book is The Wisest Things Ever Said About Chess. If your opponent offers you a draw, try to work out why he thinks he's worse off. So that's a little guideline that when you get a draw offer, try to figure out if your opponent really thinks he's worse and why is he worse. Maybe that'll help you figure out what you should do. Okay, my website, danheisman.com. Let's go there. Articles and blogs, we can go down to principles. And you notice under principles, I've got improving learning principles, thought process principles, general other principles, opening principles, middle game principles, endgame principles, and humorous principles. So we already did a few opening principles. What's an endgame principle look like? Let's click on endgame principles. And we'll see here, the king is a strong piece in the endgame with fighting power worth more than a bishop or knight. Move it toward the action. The endgame has different rules than the middle game. Resign if you are playing a better player and you get a position where if you were he, even you could win easily. Never push a passed pawn past its zone of protection, unless it promotes by force, of course. Passed pawns must be pushed, but as above, never push a pawn past its zone of protection. Connected passed pawns are usually best if pushed together. Connected passed pawns on the 6th rank beat a rook. Bishops are usually better than knights in endgames with pawns on both sides of the board. The easiest game to draw if you're down a pawn is bishops opposite color. You can be down a pawn or two and still draw in many positions. It's relatively easy to draw rook and pawn endgames. The easiest endgames to lose are king and pawn endgames, and so on and so on and so on. So we got all these principles. We got whole books on principles. But the best way to do it and the best way to learn lots of knowledge in chess is to read lots of instructive anthology and game books. If you go to my recommended book list here, and we go down here to game collections, recommended instructive game anthologies in roughly ascending order of difficulty. It starts with Logical Chess Move by Irving Chernev. And then the three most advanced ones I have here are Understanding Chess Move by John Nunn, Instructive Modern Chess Masterpieces by Igor Stoll, and Zurich 1953 by David Brunstein. So there's a lot of easier books here toward the top of the list. You want to sort of work your way up the list. You don't have to do the list in exact order. There's no way to put them in exact order of how difficult they are anyway. Okay, our last type of information is tactical patterns. I think you guys know a lot about that already. You can go to a place like chesstempo.com, and I always suggest to people start out by doing the easy 2000 repetitious tactics first. So you want to get those baseline easy tactics. You want to do them over and over and over again. Just like in math, you want to learn the multiplication tables first. So you want to do those 2000 easy tactics. I start people, here's my easy tactics books up here. Chess Tactics for Students by John Bain. Bobby Fischer Teaches Chess. Starting Out Chess Tactics and Checkmates by Ward. Winning Chess Strategy for Kids by Coakley. Chess Tactics Workbook by Willem. Back to Basics Tactics by me. The Winning Way by Bruce Pandolfini. Power Chess for Kids by Hertan. Other books if you need them. Checkmate for Children by Stark. The Art of the Checkmate by Renault and Kahn. Winning Chess Traps by Chernev. Winning Chess Tactics by Sirwan and Silman. Okay, so again, we're looking for tactic sets. Chess.com has their tactics server. They have Puzzle Rush, which doesn't keep giving you easy tactics. They start you out with easy ones and they push you up to hard ones. I think the best intermediate tactics book is Jeff Coakley's book, Winning Chess Exercises for Kids. That's not the book you see here on the screen, Winning Chess Strategy for Kids. Completely different book. Winning Chess Exercises for Kids is not really just for kids. It's a great, great, great intermediate tactics book. And of course, when you're doing all these tactics problems, then you're picking up a lot of these patterns. So when you look at them in games, it's easier for you to see them. You can see the seeds of tactical destruction. You know, there's also puzzle books for positional puzzles to recognize positional ideas. There's, I said Pandolfini's Endgame course is actually a puzzle book as opposed to Silman's Endgame course, which is more like an encyclopedia of how much you need to know at every level of, each class level needs to know a certain amount of exact endgames, using, again, that Andy Soltis term of specific endgame knowledge that you need to have. Please don't convince yourself that if you have endgame exact knowledge that you're a good endgame player, because as I said earlier in the video, most endgames are not exact endgames. Most endgames start out as with more pieces on the board with a earlier endgame where you have to use a lot of good analysis. You've got to play really slowly. Knowing the principles helps, but analyzing slowly is the main thing. Going over your games with good players and with engines and figuring out what you should do in those endgame positions. It takes a while to build up your endgame skill that way. But endgame exact knowledge, that you can get from the books we mentioned earlier in the video. Okay, so the main four areas for knowledge are opening patterns, endgame, exact endgames, principles, and pattern recognition for positions, particularly tactical patterns. They're the ones that get you the most bang for the buck because those are the ones where people win or lose material or get checkmated. And you want to, of course, be able to recognize them as best possible. Is that the only thing you can do to help your tactics? No, you still have to look for checks, captures, and threats and analyze carefully. Just knowing patterns is extremely helpful, or as we say, it's necessary but not sufficient. Okay, if you like today's video, hit that subscribe, hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, we've got about 140 videos with more coming. Hopefully you found today's video helpful in your quest to improve your chess game, and we'll see you next time. Bye.